Welcome to the Pipeline Online Podcast. In this episode, we have Blaine Mersereau with the NeeStaNan project. That's the corridor to a new port on Hudson Bay at Port Nelson. This is a project that has the backing of a great number of First Nations and might have a better chance than anything else. Hudson Bay is getting a lot of attention, and we're going to dig into it. Hello, folks. It's Brian Zinchuk here of Bronwyn Air. And we've got something that Bronwyn's really been talking about for a long time. She's wanted to talk about getting our resources to Hudson Bay. And it's had a lot of attention in news recently, not just from Churchill, which has been around forever, but a group called NeeStaNan. And in recent weeks, the Ontario government is talking about building a port on James Bay. So we've got a representative here from NeeStaNan. This is Blaine Mersereau. And we're going to dig deep into this. So Blaine, if I can ask you to introduce yourself, please, and a little bit about what you do.
Sure. Blaine Mersereau here from NeeStaNan. I'm a non-Indigenous member of the team over at NeeStaNan. It's largely an Indigenous-led project. I fit into the group as an advisor. My background that I bring is I'm a geologist by training, but I've spent the last 35 years in the energy marketing business. That includes natural gas and power and some oil. So I've joined on with a team to help them out with some of the components of the project that I can add value to, which is LNG and power in the corridor, and to try to show them how we can bring those business cases to bear on the corridor to make them work. So glad to be here.
As a geologist, you should have a fair bit to say about the rail bed. That's a pretty important thing here. Can you describe what NeeStaNan is from the 30,000-foot view?
Absolutely. NeeStaNan started off in around 2017, 2018 with a conversation between some Indigenous leaders in northern Alberta and some of the leaders in the energy industry, the oil and gas industry. They were talking about how they are having a hard time getting their products and their resources to the markets internationally. And the concept of an Indigenous-owned corridor from Alberta over to the shores of Hudson Bay could be an answer to some of the problems that we're having in the prairie provinces. So NeeStaNan itself was originally started by a company called NeeStaNan Projects, which had some private equity funding to get it going. It's evolved into a Manitoba-based company called NeeStaNan Incorporated, which is located in Winnipeg. And it has largely ownership by the First Nations in Manitoba, and with a small equity ownership of NeeStaNan Projects. NeeStaNan Projects plans to reduce their interest in NeeStaNan Incorporated over time as more First Nations get involved with the project. So, does that help?
Yeah, Bronwyn?
Yeah, that does help. I guess so. You've described this as an Indigenous-owned, as you were just saying, utility corridor. How are we to understand the utility corridor part? You mentioned power, you mentioned LNG. What would actually be transported, and from where to Port Nelson?
Okay, terrific. Just talk about the corridor, for example. One of the two big threats or problems that industry has to get over when they look at large linear projects like this is, can they get First Nation support for the project? And do they have confidence in getting the environmental approvals? So what the concept here is that NeeStaNan will undertake to assemble a corridor with contiguous pieces of First Nations controlled land, and we will do the environmental assessments for anything that goes in that corridor. So we get those two biggest hurdles over with in developing the corridor. And the corridor itself is just intended to be a corridor. And it would be a corridor that would be available to other companies that want to develop a power line, or a rail line, a road, or a telecommunication line, or a pipeline. We've tried to stay away from oil pipelines because a lot of the nations that we've talked to along the right of way would prefer not to have an oil pipeline through the corridor. So we do hold out the possibility of having bitumen, which is consider crude oil to be in a solid form, like pucks, like hockey pucks. We have considered moving bitumen by rail all the way to Tidewater, and for markets that we believe are in Europe for asphalt binders. So not trying to send oil over to Europe to have it burned and create CO2 emissions, but sending bitumen over to help them with building roads and whatnot in Europe.
All right, this begs the question. The corridor shows from Fort McMurray across northern Saskatchewan to a Hudson Bay port. The only purpose to build to Fort McMurray is to access bitumen as fluid through a pipeline. I mean, that's what the premiers Moe and Smith have been talking about. I'm not sure what Premier Canoe's on that, but they've been recently talking about this just a few weeks ago about the need for a northern corridor. And no one goes to Hawaii unless they want to sunbathe. No one goes to Fort McMurray unless they want oil.
Right.
And why would you go to corridor to Fort McMurray for anything other than that?
Okay, well, like I said earlier, it was more for the bitumen aspect rather than crude oil by rail. And the corridor itself was intended to have a rail right away along it to allow bitumen by rail to get to Tidewater and Hudson Bay. So we have not proposed an oil pipeline, but if we have talked to people that would like to move bitumen by rail, but no one has approached us yet on putting an oil pipeline in the corridor.
How would you classify or characterize support so far for this project? I guess, specifically from, the First Nations, the Indigenous buy-in perspective. Certainly I recall from my days in energy with the government, here in Saskatchewan. I mean, there were a number of projects that have come and gone, and many of them, of course. I mean, I think of a Northern Gateway where really a lot of what came down to its non-success in the end was differences of opinion, very strong differences of opinion between, in that case, hereditary chiefs and other chiefs and so on. And there, regrettably came to be this infighting on that front around that project, along with other issues. But when we talk about, this utility corridor, would you say that support among the impacted First Nations is 60%, 70, 17? What are we talking? And I guess as a follow-up to that, what work still needs to be done in order to garner buy-in to the project, and what work have you done with provinces and the federal government? Okay.
Back in, talk about the provinces to start with. It's the easiest to deal with. Back in, I think it was August in 2023, the three prairie provinces signed an MOU supporting the development of a trade or an economic corridor through the provinces. So we did have indications of support, an MOU amongst the provinces to do that. And we did have some initial representations for funding to allow us to get through the feasibility stage for the port on Hudson Bay. That was moving along quite well until we had the election in Manitoba. And the Conservative government was out, the NDP government were in, and they had their views as to which projects they would like to support. And we really had not done an awful lot of work in developing relationships with the key ministers in the NDP. So we've been rebuilding those relationships ever since. And I think, as of a couple months ago, Wab Kinew, Premier of Manitoba, said, you know what, I think we might need a second port on Hudson Bay. So this is a sign that the NDP government is moving in the direction that we're hoping. They haven't yet necessarily embraced a NeeStaNan, but they do recognize that having more than one port in Hudson Bay is actually good for trade. Having more options for ships coming into Hudson Bay as to where they can dock gives the vessels more confidence on going into this trade route. So in addition to that, we have seen in the past, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but Churchill for a while was left without a supply route when the rail line was put out of service because of some flooding. We think that Port Nelson would certainly be able to supply Churchill by barge, in the event that they did lose access to that rail line in the future.
Has Premier Kinew come out explicitly on Port Nelson? I had read that Kinew has cited Churchill as one of 5 initiatives that Manitoba is pitching to the federal government to expand Canada's energy exports. So I have read quite a few comments now by Premier Canoe on Churchill and Hudson Bay. I just hadn't heard the second port support that you referenced. So he's been explicit about that, has he?
Yeah, I think about 2 months ago, he hosted a delegation of Europeans to go to Churchill. And shortly after they came back from Churchill, I think there was a message left with Wab Canoe that Churchill's nice, but it's not going to meet the needs. It's not an Antwerp or a Rotterdam by any means. And I think the Europeans felt that we're going to need another port other than Churchill to gain the Europeans' confidence.
So let's talk about that for a bit here. This is what Churchill looks like, and folks, just so you understand, I mentioned this to Blaine earlier. I have some familial relationship with this. That when my stepfather graduated from high school, just as my son did a couple weeks ago, he actually missed his graduation because he had to get on a train to go work as a tugboat hand at Churchill. And this here is a slide from your presentation, is the port of Churchill. You see the red line on the left side where it says 1.3 kilometers. There's basically berths for 2 or 3 ships at most at Churchill. And it's not the deepest port around, and there's not a huge amount of space there. I mean, now there's a lot more than what is currently at Port Nelson, but I mean, it's not, like I said, it's not a Rotterdam by any stretch. Rotterdam's the biggest port in the world, so that's kind of a neither here nor there. But This is what Churchill looks like, and this is what Port Nelson looks like. Now, this is historically 100 years ago. The original plan for the Hudson Bay Railroad was to come to Port Nelson, which is at the opening of Nelson River, which is the outflow of all the rivers of the prairies that flow into Lake Winnipeg, flow out of the Nelson River, which means all the silt that goes with it, all the way from the Rockies, all comes out that. And 100 years ago, they didn't have very big ships. They didn't have very big equipment. They did a lot of stuff by shovel. Silting was a major issue, and they decided, from my understanding, if I'm wrong on any of this, Blaine, please correct me.
I think you're right.
They decided that instead of continuing with this project, this is 100 years abandoned, so I mean, it's falling to pieces, but there's really nothing there. This is not what we're talking about. It would be something much more significant than this.
Right.
But the same general location.
Yeah.
This would be. They instead of going to Port Nelson along an esker, and I'd like you to explain that, especially as a geologist, they decided to make a right turn, and I think the other slide here shows it. Which one is it? They made a left turn, and they went to Churchill. Sorry, give me a second, folks. And when they did that, they went through a lot of muskeg. Now, anyone who's built pipeline through muskeg, that's not fun. So, Blaine, can you tell us the differences between the rail beds and the differences between the two ports, and what Churchill brought then that it doesn't bring now?
Yeah, I think if you could find a slide that's a little bit earlier on the slide deck there that might help us out, which shows Churchill and even before that.
Nope.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's Port Nelson. There's Churchill.
Right.
Bath Escape. Hold on, that one.
Yeah. Back a little bit further. Well, maybe the other way.
Sorry, folks.
Okay. Keep going. Okay, let's back up that one slide there.
Yeah, right there.
So back in the 1920s, they tried to build a railroad over to Port Nelson, and by and large, the right of way was fairly sound up until I got to a place called Amory, which is currently a spot on the Hudson Bay Rail where the rail line turns straight north and goes to Churchill. And what happened was from Amory up to Churchill, the rail line passes through lots of wetlands where the railway is either passing through a swamp or muskeg or supported by underlying melting permafrost. So it's a difficult section of the railway to maintain and keep operational. In fact, in 2018, I think the rail line was washed out and Churchill was left unserviced or unsupplied for a period of time until they could get the railway rebuilt. The railway changed hands during that period of time. It eventually was owned by a collection of about 38 or 40 First Nations and communities in northern Manitoba. And there was some government funding, both provincial and federal funding, that was advanced or given over to Hudson Bay Rail and the Arctic Gateway Group to rebuild that rail line and get it back into service. So I think there's been upwards of a little over $500 million directed towards Arctic Gateway and Hudson Bay. Here we go. This is a good one. So it's this last 250 kilometers from Amory up to Churchill that passes through the land that's difficult to maintain. So
we're talking, when we say it's difficult, I mean literally. Switch views here. Like the rail line is like this.
Right.
I've seen pictures of it, and I mean the cars cannot go at full speed. You're not doing 60 or 100 kilometers an hour. You're doing like 12, 20, and it's literally topsy turvy because the ground is shifting always under it.
Right.
And this is one of it makes the train line to go ride to go up there, because there is no road to Churchill. A very long ride, very uncomfortable ride. But also, if you had, let's say, crude by rail, which has been discussed, to Churchill, you've got rail cars going like this, full of crude oil. I don't think that's exactly the smartest thing to do in case it goes like that. I mean, am I wrong on this, Blaine, or is that?
Oh, you're that's exactly the reason why we want to go to Port Nelson rather than Churchill. Is that last 250 kilometers to Churchill is a risk, an element of risk that we don't want to have in our business case.
So,
and Brian, just before you leave that point, for those who can't actually see what we just saw, someone should describe those or read some of the details around both of those last two slides, because it's pretty interesting. And when you visualize it, I hadn't seen those images. I find that very interesting. So sort of describe those out. So
basically, when you follow the Nelson River, which has most of the dams that Manitoba Hydro uses to generate power. You get to pretty close to the last dam, and this is where the river widens up, and maybe there'll be future dams, and I don't know. But at Amory, the road ends at Gillum, and you go, 50 kilometers, 80 kilometers further to Amory. And originally, the railway bed was built to Port Nelson in the 1910s, built by hand and by horses. They didn't have much in the way of heavy equipment, and instead they abandoned the Port Nelson idea, and then they did a different route going straight north up to Churchill across 250 kilometers of basically crappy muskeg.
Right.
And Blaine, if you can explain here, especially as the geologist that you are, one of the things in doing my homework for this I found very interesting is the reference that the rail bed that was built, that could be refurbished and built up with going to Port Nelson, is on a hard-packed esker.
Right.
Can you explain what that is and how significant it is? Because I think that's a big honking deal.
Well, the big thing is that the esker is not muskeg or swamp. It's a high ridge of land along the side of the river, which is largely gravel or rock or very stable material to build upon. Whereas, if you turn north to go up to Churchill, you no longer have that benefit of a hard, dry underlying surface. You've got a wetland that you're passing through. It could be a swamp, it could be a muskeg, or it could be underlying permafrost that's melting. Mm-hmm. You just don't have that support. And you mentioned earlier, Brian, the trains have to go fairly slow over this period of this stretch of rail. And this is an important issue, because if we want to have a port that's functioning, we need to have trains going back and forth in and out of that port fairly quickly to keep bringing inventories in and taking inventories away. We have troubles trying to do that and hauling our trains through the swamplands and the last 250 kilometers on the Hudson Bay Rail. In addition to that, the Port of Churchill only operates 3 or 4 months of the year.
Yeah.
It operates in like August, September, October, whereas we would need a port that would operate year round.
So I really want to get into that. Keep going.
anyway, so the Port of Churchill is fine. You know, it was well built for the purpose that it had at the time. You would bring in inventories during the wintertime and stock up your warehouses when the rail line was frozen, and you could bring in heavier trains. In the summertime, I don't think it was such a wise idea to bring those heavy trains through the muskeg. So you emptied your inventories in the summertime when the ice was gone and the ships could come in. But when the shipping season closed, you couldn't use the port anymore. You have to wait for the winter time to come and have the rail line freeze up again so you could bring in more inventory. So it's just operationally a nice little port, but it doesn't have the ability to have the economies of scale and the year-round service that we envision for ours.
Before we get into that deeper here, we need to go to a commercial break briefly, and then Bronwyn you'll get
Just
right
had a
to
quick
here.
question on that, yeah.
Terrific.
So 30 seconds, folks. For your well servicing needs in southeast Saskatchewan and southwest Manitoba, you need the General. That's General Well Servicing of Cardiff, Saskatchewan. They've got a fleet of double, triple rigs, pressure vessels, and lighting rentals ready to serve you. They can perform rig assist and frac assist operations as well. Call Kevin at 306-482-3244. That's Call the General at 306-482-3244. Yes, sir. Hey,
Yeah, no, and I know we're going to talk about the ice thing and a lot of the operational issues around that. But just before we get to that, so obviously this is kind of the story of 2 ports, 3 ports if you count James Bay, and that's its own issue. And Brian, you referenced how very, very shallow it is and probably unworkable for the purposes the country would need it for. But so the one you're proposing, obviously. It's the old York factory, right? I mean, Port Nelson, Hudson's Bay fame, and as we've said, at the mouth of the Nelson River, traditionally the heavy silt, which we've talked about, and that island that was built out to sort of accommodate it. Obviously, much smaller boats when it was, originally got going. Then versus the Churchill port, which is owned and operated by 41 First Nations. You referenced that, the Arctic Gateway Group. Only open 4 months of the year. Churchill, as we know, has developed into this polar bear tourism destination that might come with its own hair in terms of, expanding that port further. And then, the 8 meters deep. And Brian, you've done work on this about how tankers generally need, more like a 20 meters deep. I guess, what was the justification when there was originally that move to, sort of away from Port Nelson up toward Churchill? What was the justification for that? Why was there that second port actually built? Why didn't they just build up Port Nelson, or what am I missing there?
Brian, I'll take this.
Yep.
Okay. So from what I understand, and I wasn't there, Brian, when I wasn't there, it was 100 or so years ago.
No, obviously.
but
historically, I do mean it, obviously. Historically, it's kind of interest how that developed, Churchill.
Yeah. But it appears that the siltation they just had a hard time keeping the port dredged and usable with the technologies that they had at that time. Mm-hmm. So there's a fair amount of siltation coming down the river, and since then there's been 4 large power dams built on the river. So the siltation mechanisms are no longer the same today as they were 100 years ago. So a lot of those currents are slowed right down with the power dams. Mm. And they were relying upon state-of-the-art dredging barge to keep the port open.
I just show people here, if you take a look on the bottom right here, that is the wreck of the barge back 100 years ago, which, honest to God, compared to some farm equipment you see now, I probably know farmers around Estevan have bigger engines on their tractors than that barge did. So,
and to be clear, this is Port Nelson.
This is Port Nelson, 100 years,
Right.
So the dredging capacity then to now is, unbelievably different. You mentioned Rotterdam.
Right.
There's a 54-kilometer long dredged channel to bring super tankers into Rotterdam that is dredged to 24 meters deep. Right. In China, in the South China Sea, has actually created islands out of nothing by dredging shoals and created islands that they've built military bases on. So, I mean, the hardware 100 years later is absolutely phenomenal. And even for building a rail line, one D10 dozer can probably do the work literally of 100 men of horses.
Yeah. We hear the comment quite often that it didn't work 100 years ago, it's not going to work today. Well, they didn't have internet 100 years ago either, so the technology is coming off a long way. But the important thing is that this is not the location that NeeStaNan is considering for a port. We would choose a location that's outside the mouth of the Nelson River, further up into the Wapusk National Park, probably 20 kilometers further north than the existing Port Nelson site. So we would be looking for a site that actually is facing the open bay, a place where the deep water comes as close to the shore as possible. And we would build our port offshore, not too different than, say, Tawasin or Delta Port outside of Vancouver.
So you just said through the national park. Now, most people think Manitoba only has one national park, Riding Mountain.
Right.
But in reality, in recent years, a new national park, which occupies almost all the land from Port Nelson to Churchill, which is not accessible by road, rail, or anything but an airplane, was established. How does that throw a monkey wrench into your plans?
Well, the park is certainly there. The Fox Lake for Cree Nation is the entity that's leading our effort. They have a little over 26,000 acres of treaty land entitlement that's available to them. York Factory, which is also aligning with us, they have over 26,000 acres available to them that they haven't dedicated to. And the representations we've had from the federal and provincial governments is that, if there was a case to move some of that treaty land entitlement into the park, there would certainly be, cooperation on the other side to allow them to do that. So if they did want to reach out there and claim some of that land under treaty land, there's a willingness, I think, at the government level to do that.
So you mentioned something here about how big this port is. And I mean, when I look at the list of stuff, we are not talking small. I mean, I'm just going to go through a checklist of stuff that I wrote down from your from the video that you guys have. And it's very, very well produced video, by the way, promotional for this. So let's just check them off. Liquefied natural gas. Yes.
Okay. Yep. That's something that is a very key part to the port's operation.
Okay. Oil, maybe.
No one is talking to us about oil, and we have not said that we're moving oil.
Okay. Potash.
Potash is probably one of the first two commodities that we would like to see through the port. Potash would probably come first. It requires the least amount of infrastructure, but the LNG operations would be year-round operations, and that's where we get the economies of scale to keep the port developed and operating year-round.
Nickel.
An ore, yep, that's certainly something that could come out of northern Manitoba or northern Ontario.
Critical minerals. Those don't have a lot of volume.
Right.
What about grain? Are you considering grain at all?
Grain, yeah, certainly grain is something that could come through the port to the extent that Churchill already has a bit of a grain business. We wouldn't want to take that away from Churchill. We would try to be accretive or add to different functionality rather than trying to take business away from Churchill.
We call it shipping containers.
Yep, shipping containers. That could be a very key part of moving bitumen to Europe. Is having shipping containers which are aligned with a membrane and allow us to ship the solid pieces of bitumen over to Europe and bring the containers back with other commodities in them.
Is there any other products under consideration?
Power. We think that Manitoba has great potential to be a source of renewable power for other provinces. We're going to the point of considering a high voltage direct current line over to Quebec to allow Quebec to have access to markets in Western Canada. And we'd like to see a high voltage power transmission line possibly in the NeeStaNan corridor. What's not widely known is that power in Alberta cannot flow into Saskatchewan and vice versa. There's a break in the transmission grids there. Both provinces are 60 cycles a second. They're both AC currents. But Saskatchewan and Alberta their systems are not in phase. So you would have to convert the AC power in one province to DC and then reshape it into an AC curve on the other side. We think that Alberta is probably a better trading partner for Manitoba than North Dakota or Minnesota.
So you're talking about then building in this,
Right.
going back to the route map here,
Right.
a high voltage DC line all the way from Manitoba to the Fort McMurray area. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. The power transmission grid in Alberta is very strong in Fort McMurray, and the power transmission grid along the Nelson River Valley is also very strong. That's where most of the power is generated in Manitoba, is along the Nelson River.
Yeah. So what you're talking about, that is very correct. That when you get to the Alberta border, there is Alberta and points west belong to the Western Interconnect, and we belong to the Eastern Interconnect. And there is one small intertie in southern Alberta, Saskatchewan, near Gull Lake that allows transfer of some power, but not much. And it's a real pain in the neck. You can't easily trade power across the border between the two of them.
Correct. Yeah, that converter station is called the McNeil station, and it really has capacity to allow 150 megawatts of power to pass through it. A couple months ago, Alberta was in a situation where the power grid was close to being knocked out of service, like it might go down, and they brought in 200 megawatts of power from Saskatchewan. In actual fact, that was 200 megawatts probably came from Manitoba as they moved the power across Saskatchewan. But probably truthfully, the power probably came from North Dakota. And it just flowed from one region to the next, to the next, to the next, and finally got delivered to Alberta.
Yeah, and that intertie actually has been down for emergency use only. I still think it's been down for almost 6 months now. Not sure if it's up to full capacity. Let's get back to the port here, because we are going to run out of time. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about.
Okay.
You talked about year-round shipping. Please explain NeeStaNan's concept of how they're going to accomplish year-round shipping.
Okay, so well, first of all, you need a business that's going to give you the revenue and the need to have a year-round port, and LNG is certainly one of those businesses that we can attract to the port. We would see the port being developed on a probably another island developed offshore, maybe about 2 kilometers offshore, so that you can get the island out past the fast ice, which forms along the shore, which is very, very, very hard. We would want to get into the softer, the ear ice. That's a little bit further out to sea. And we recognize that we're going to have a breakwater to keep that ice off our infrastructure, and we'll probably have to have icebreakers to keep the route up through the Hudson Passage open through the winter months. Yeah.
So how many icebreakers and what category of icebreakers we talking? Because I think the ice in Hudson Bay in the depths of winter gets a lot thicker than it does on the St. Lawrence Seaway.
Yeah, the whole ice solution is yet to be determined. NeeStaNan right now is at the feasibility stage of looking at whether or not this port can be feasible and designed and operational and feasible. So the ice management strategies would probably be delved into in the feasibility stage, and we would come out of that with a much better understanding as to what's going to be required. But the Russians are doing it all year long anyhow with their LNG facilities, and they have large icebreakers that they keep their shipping lanes open through the wintertime. And they have ice class LNG carriers that can come in the winter months to pick up LNG. We would be accessing the same ice class LNG carriers to come in.
So this here is a graphic of it was just approved a few weeks ago. Canadian government ordered 2 polar class icebreakers, $3 billion plus a piece.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, how many do you think you need? Because here is, folks, this is what a year's worth of ice looks like on Hudson Bay. It's retreat and it's advance. And when it is fully advanced, it goes all the way to the northern tip of Labrador.
Right.
So compare that to Russia, if you could. And I find that very interesting with Russia. I don't mean, sorry to interrupt, but it's a good point. I mean, Russia does operate through a lot of ice and have maneuvered this in the Arctic for a while. I mean, of course, they also wanted Crimea, as a port. But explain, if you could, that kind of compare and contrast with what they've been able to achieve and what you think we could.
Well, Russia's certainly had a lot of successes in developing LNG manufacturing facilities up in the Yamal Peninsula, and they've developed these. It's like a fairly large world-class industrial park sitting right on the ocean, right on the shore of the ocean. And, so they put a lot of money into this. LNG, natural gas sales, is a big part of their economy. So they've developed the manufacturing facilities, and they try and keep those things going all year long with nuclear-powered icebreakers. Do we consider, Canada needing nuclear-powered icebreakers? Probably not. Probably conventional ones, but it's the LNG ice class carriers that are really, really important to have those. Now, I don't think the ice class carriers are going to be able to break the ice. I think you'll still need to have the use of the icebreakers to keep the channel open. But to have ice class carriers coming into our port is going to be very important. And one of the reasons why you don't have ships coming in for more than 3 months of the year is probably for insurance reasons. The ships just can't get the insurance to come into this region of the world during certain times of the year. We'd like to do what we can to keep those channels open so that you can have insurance companies willing to support ships coming into this territory. Oh, we lost you, Brian.
Unmute, Brian.
Sorry, I always do that. I want to go back to the ice map for a second here, because for parts of the year, and it's not a long part, but for a few months of the year, when you do have ice going all the way to the tip of Labrador,
right? That
distance is, I think I worked it out, it's like 1,700 kilometers, and when you're moving through heavy ice like that, you're ice breaking at 3 knots. When you have the full extent of ice through the Hudson Bay, through Hudson Strait, I calculate that's roughly 12 days of ice breaking just to get to open water. That really, a lot of the other arguments that you have here about how short it is to, in this map here, for instance, going to South America, if you have to do 5 or 10 or 12 days of ice breaking, doesn't that kind of hurt your math at least for part of a year?
It certainly does.
Yeah.
Sorry. The Russia just made an announcement that they've sent an LNG carrier over to Asia, Southeast Asia, and they traversed through the Arctic waters further north than what we are, and they managed 10 to 14 knots for the entire trip through the ice. So, they might be able to travel a little bit faster than you think, Brian. It's not going to be the same as being on the open ocean, but you can still, the Russians are able to do this at a fairly good clip. I would see us being able to do that as well.
So here we got, this is the map that your slides show going, the advantage of shipping out of Hudson Bay for potash, for instance, to South America.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about the reduced, going right into the center of North America, really central Canada,
Right.
How advantageous that is?
So, currently Saskatchewan's probably one of the world's largest sources of potash, and that potash can move through the Great Lakes. It can move through Halifax. It can move through the Gulf of Mexico, but by and large, it's being railed to the shore of British Columbia, loaded onto some ships around Vancouver, shipped down the Pacific coast to the Panama Canal, through the Panama Canal, over into the Atlantic Basin, to where it can find some ports in Brazil, and maybe they're further south than where it's shown here. But we think that there's probably a lot of cost savings if you can shorten that route and get the potash onto a ship as quickly as possible, because it's the most efficient way of shipping potash. So to get it onto a ship as fast as possible and enjoy a more direct route to Brazil. So we think we can probably save $40 to $50 a ton in shipping costs if we access to the Hudson Bay to the Atlantic Basin route.
Has there been any direct discussion, or is it all still too preliminary with the Canpotexes of this world and the private companies? Let's take potash, for example. I mean, they have undertaken efforts in the past to try to access Pacific markets via rail line and so on through the States and, through Oregon and that route. I mean, are they actively advocating for this? I mean, for example, vis-a-vis access to South America through Brazilian ports, or is this more a kind of a trial balloon thing at this stage? I just wonder about the private company advocacy.
Yeah. A couple of things that are important there is that they've already got a fair amount of infrastructure built for other routes that they're relying upon. And NeeStaNan is at such an early stage where we've still yet to gain credibility and confidence from the potash producers. So as we get through the feasibility study and we can show that it works, we can show that this the locations that we're choosing are good for ports, and we can get it done. I think we'll probably get more time with the big companies. But right now, we're having a hard time, getting them to take us seriously until we get further down the development curve.
One of the things that I was wondering about here is, because you're basically starting from a clean sheet. I mean, you're looking at designing an offshore island. You don't have 100 or 200, or in European cases 400 years or more of legacy infrastructure you have to work around. You can basically create whatever you want and create it as perfectly as you want. Does that give you an opportunity? So, like, if you build this island, you can build it large enough that, hey, we can have 2 berths for shipping containers, and we can have a berth or 2 for LNG, and another one for potash, and all these other things, and maybe oil down the road or something like that. Does this give you a chance to really stretch out and say, hey, we can do whatever we want because we are on a clean sheet?
Yeah, absolutely. If we look back at that picture of Churchill, it's got a fairly limited footprint available to it, right, for infrastructure.
Yeah, I'll pull it up here in a second. There we go.
Yeah, this is a good slide. So you've got the port of Churchill basically sitting in the mouth of the Churchill River. It's fresh water, and you've got on the other side of the peninsula, you've got the sea, the salt water of Hudson Bay. When we look at, say, Delta Port, which is just south of Vancouver, they've got a footprint that looks sort of this. It's the same as the red outline there that we're showing relative to Churchill. Prince Rupert, another multifunctional port that we would like to emulate, has even a bigger footprint than what Churchill has to offer. So we, as far as the land goes, we're not restricted on the land in Port Nelson. We've got fairly large, expansive tracts of land on shore that we can build upon. We would have to build another terminal out into the waterways, but as far as the size of the facility, we're not restricted like Churchill is.
Well, one of the things that most people may not understand, I've spent a fair bit of time on Google Earth, probably an unhealthy amount of time. And when you take a look at how China has developed their ports and Hong Kong and whatnot, most ports like this are literally built up from dredged sand and built because you want them to be perfectly flat. You want them to be able to be paved and have rail and everything. And having that capacity, as opposed to dealing with existing geology, you kind of get a better advantage. We do have to go to one more commercial here for a second, folks, and then we'll be back in a minute.
Terrific.
So hold on. There's a reason that HG Jack has dominated Saskatchewan's oil patch. That's because that distinctive curved walking beam reduces energy consumption by about 25%. That means 25% less power bills, 25% less carbon tax. That's a big difference. And it's available exclusively from Grime Sales and Service, Batman, Saskatchewan. Before we continue on here, we had a comment from Brian Crossman earlier. He asked, did the Alaska Highway and Pipeline cross Muskeg?
I have no idea. I haven't looked at the Alaskan Highway.
I'm not sure either, but this does lead to the next question I did have here in regards to...
Just one thing on that. The pipeline, though, was suspended, right, or elevated?
That's the Alaska Pipeline, which is a different right-of-way. Right. So I want to take a look here at... here we're looking at northern Saskatchewan, northern Alberta, and you take a look at it. When you leave Fort McMurray, once you get a couple hundred kilometers east of that, almost all of the Saskatchewan terrain and most of the Alberta or Manitoba terrain is Canadian Shield. And that is rocks and trees and rocks and water, and a lot of it. And it's some of the most difficult terrain on the planet to build on. How are you going to go through all that? Hundreds and hundreds, I forget, it might be over 1,000 kilometers of Canadian Shield. How are you going to do that?
Yeah. Can you back up to a slide which showed that nice yellow broad line that crossed the 3 provinces?
Yeah, I will do that right now.
Okay. Oh. So this is a very, very good question, Brian. So the reason why it's not a direct line, say from Churchill over to Port Nelson or Port Nelson over to Fort McMurray, the line dips down there's a reason why it's sort of shown where it is. It's far enough south that it's not in the wetlands to the north, which are difficult to build in, but it's far enough north not to get caught up in a lot of the private agricultural lands to the south. So this isn't a detailed route as to where the corridor would be. It's just a generalization as to the regions where we have to go through, and the corridor itself would probably be 1 kilometer, 3 kilometers wide. But this is a general region where it would pass through. It shows you the communities that that will be affected, and the communities that we're going to have to be dealing with. So again, it's a good question. We're far enough south where we don't have to really go through a lot of the wetlands, but we're far enough north that we don't have to start buying up more expensive agricultural lands from private farmers.
And then are we to assume that these on this map, and just for those who can't see the map, I mean, the Meadow Lake Tribal Council is noted, Prince Albert Tribal Council is noted. We have here effort led by NeeStaNan, Fox Lake Cree Nation, and the Assini group. But with these tribal councils, which are explicitly mentioned here, and then just going through the areas that are outlined in this map, are we to assume then that the buy-in at this point is pretty much there?
No. In fact, we've had a fair amount of discussions with Treaty 8 in Alberta. That's gone very, very well. Northern Saskatchewan, we haven't done nearly as much work as we need to, but we have met with many of the First Nations along the ways. And the comments that we've got back from a lot of the chiefs is, what's there not to like? You're helping us assemble some First Nations controlled land. You're trying to attract tenants to install infrastructure on that land to help us provide more revenues for our people. What's there not to like? And they wish to sell the best luck in the world.
Right. And sorry, we should also mention that it says here 40 Indigenous communities are impacted. Just on it, if I may, and then Brian, back to you again, though, on the buy-in point, you referenced, I believe you said something along the lines of 500 million has been provided to the Arctic Gateway Group for the Churchill Port project since around 2017-18, I believe you said. Any idea, I mean, where that's at? And I'm not asking you to speak to that project, but in terms of this project, is that provincial funding? Is that equity ownership arrangement proposals? Is that federal funding? How are we to think of, if you have any idea, the 500 million for the Churchill project, and then how funding you see rolling out for this one, when you reference, for example, the Indigenous group saying, what's not to like?
Right. That $500 million was it was both federal and provincial funding, and it went to the Arctic Gateway Group, who would allocate it to different parts of their operation. Some of it would have went to rehabilitating, say, the port and the wharf. A lot of it would have went to just rebuilding the rail line from Amory up to Churchill, and I think that's where the majority of the majority of the money is being spent. So, in the 40 Indigenous communities that currently own Arctic Gateway, the Arctic Gateway Group, those are just in northern Manitoba. So I think there's like 38 First Nations and 4 of the communities like the Paw, Thompson, Churchill. You've got some non-Indigenous communities there that have an ownership as well in Arctic Gateway.
So one of the biggest issues, I mean, as you said, what's not to like, a similar discussion has likely been had when it came to the Northern Gateway pipeline and when it came to Coastal GasLink. And indeed, if the Coastal GasLink project, which got a lot of attention before COVID, right, the elected member councils of the Wet'suwet'en and other tribes out there, First Nations, they were in support of it, but the hereditary chiefs who were not democratically elected stood against it, and we had a nationwide uprising and blockades and everything prior to COVID, and some very serious damage done during the construction of that pipeline because some First Nations did not feel that they wanted to be part of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. They did not feel that what's not to like.
Right.
How do you get around, I guess, as someone who used to build pipelines myself, the biggest thing behind a project, whether it's a pipeline or rail or whatever, the biggest obstacle is not the financing, it's not the technology. We have lots of big equipment now. It is, can you get First Nations to on board and not fight the damn thing?
Right. just the approach that we're taking, I think, helps us deal with that, Brian. It is a First Nations led project. It's the First Nations community own NeeStaNan. Right now, we're focusing on just Port Nelson itself and developing a 100-kilometer rail spur to get from Amory over to Port Nelson. All of our efforts right now are just focused on that. And if on the surface, it just looks like it's Fox Lake and York Factory that are most affected. But there's another group called the Home Guard Cree, which is a collection of 5 First Nations, of which Fox Lake and York Factory are 2. But you've also got Shamatnawa, you've got Tatasquawak, and I think you've got War Lake in there. We're currently trying to work with those entities to bring them into the fold of NeeStaNan to get their support in developing, at first, just the railway from Amory to Port Nelson, and the port that we're trying to consider on the shore of Hudson Bay. Once we can get that done, then we can concentrate on, actually assembling the rest of the right of way over to Alberta. So,
are we talking a road as in addition to any rail or any pipe or anything like that? Because I think all weather and preferably paved roads would be a huge benefit to any First Nation along the right of way.
Absolutely. Well, from Thompson up to Amory or Gillam, it's going to be 3 or 4 hours of gravel road right now, and we're talking about another 100 kilometers of road. You'd almost have to build the road alongside the railway, and just to bring people back and forth as you're developing the railway. And you're going to need a road to get up to the port anyhow. So we would see absolutely a road and a railway up to the port.
And what about the rest of the right of way over to Fort McMurray?
Okay, well, that's yet to be determined. So right now, our feasibility study is just looking at developing this railway section from Amory to Port Nelson and developing Port Nelson. So that's where our focus is on right now. If we can get through that, if we can get through a positive outcome in the feasibility study, we'll go ahead and we'll build those infrastructures. And then we'll start focusing on assembling the corridor all the way back to Fort McMurray. But it's going to take us 2 years to finish the feasibility study just for the short rail line that we're trying to build in the port. I don't see us spending a lot of time on the northern Saskatchewan part till at least 2 years down the road, once we get phase 1 done for NeeStaNan.
And I'm assuming those feasibility studies are being funded by provincial governments then?
So far, well, we originally had a plan where it would be funded by the 3 prairie provinces. But we've had a fair amount of investment from the oil and gas industry saying, look, if you think you can get this thing done, we'd like to be there to support you. And they've been there right from the beginning.
So it's privately funded, or it's a mix?
Yeah, we've got some private equity coming in from individuals that help us with this. And their whole effort and expectation is that their money would be returned to them, and they would wind down their ownership interest in the company as First Nations picked up their ownership positions.
I guess going back to my old days, sorry to interrupt. Sorry, I was just going to say my old days in energy. I spoke to operators at the time, private companies at the time about this, and I have to say I never heard anyone be wildly positive about the feasibility, speaking of the feasibility studies, and really bottom line, which private company would be operating this? Now, you're not saying that. You're saying it would be individually, or it would be indigenous owned and operated, or I think that's what you're saying, but with potentially, private equity and private involvement obviously woven in. I guess just bottom line on the feasibility, I think that it's very complex to look at this from a funding model, right? I mean, it's going to be extremely expensive.
Yeah. We're starting the ball rolling with private equity, getting the feasibility study initiated. We certainly expect some federal funding to come in, either through the Canadian Infrastructure Bank or various mechanisms and vehicles that are available to the First Nations to take it further.
So before we sum up, if you heard, did we actually talk? I know we talked beforehand, but did we talk on air about the Ontario idea of James Bay at all? I don't know if we have.
No, we haven't.
So just in 2 weeks ago, right around the time that Brahma and I were doing the last podcast, the Premier Ford and Premier Smith of Ontario and Alberta spoke about building a port on James Bay, which is the southern appendage, I guess you could say, of Hudson Bay. So it's part of Hudson Bay on the west side of it. And no locations were given, but I took a good look at that, the bathymetric, that's the depth map of James Bay. And I looked all along the western side of it, and there is nowhere that is anywhere close to being deep enough to bring in tankers or any large ships of anything. I pulled up this slide here. Can you please talk about it, Blaine?
Sure. We saw the same thing that you did, Brian. More recently, Ontario was talking about, originally they were talking about a port at Port Albany, and now they're more focused on Moosonee. But both those regions are much the same. The slide, or the picture at the bottom left-hand side of this, the picture shown at the bottom left-hand side, is a bathymetric map showing you how deep the water is once you get offshore. And what it's clear is that you have to go 40 or 50 kilometers just to get to water that's deep enough for ocean-going ships. So I think it's an aspiration at best for Ontario to develop a deep sea port in James Bay. But they don't have an awful lot of shoreline to work with in Hudson Bay, and what they do have within James Bay, I think, is pretty shallow. It'd be nice to have a deep sea port and those locations to help complement the Ring of Fire aspirations and developments there. I think they're going to find that if they do want to do that, it's going to be very, very expensive. NeeStaNan has met with the Ontario government and said, I don't know what's going to come out of your feasibility study, but if this is something you really, really want to do, we can support a port at either Port Albany or Moosonee with barges from Port Nelson. If we can do that, we'd be more than happy to do what we need to do on our side to accommodate barging down to Port Albany or Moosonee. So we hear what they're saying, and we're willing to be there to help them if there's a way that we can help them with their aspirations.
So I just want to get into that a little bit deeper here. So let's say this is the ocean depth, or this is the surface. And for us landlubbers here in Prairie Chicken, Saskatchewan, if your ship is so an Aframax, which would be the size of ship that's coming out of Westridge Port for a TMX, an Aframax ship, which is not just for tankers but for other sizes, has a draft of 12 to 16 meters. So that's how much depth you're going to need. And the problem is that the western shore of James Bay is only like 6 to 8. So you're going to have to dredge basically half your depth. And it is possible to do. They've done this for Rotterdam, but Rotterdam is the most valuable port on the planet, at least in the Western Hemisphere. And they did a 53-kilometer long channel. But I don't know how you would do this when it comes to, especially in a much, much smaller, less significant port. And if your channel is only, let's say, a couple hundred meters wide, what happens if you're going through ice and icebreakers and you're coming down through that port and the ice pushes you over out of the channel? I don't know how you deal with that. Maybe it's doable. Maybe the Russians do it. I don't know. But just looking at the geography or I guess the bathymetry, the depth of James Bay, it looks to me like it's a total non-starter. And it's horrible for them, great for you guys.
Well, I would wish them luck. If they can get that to work, great. But like you say, Brian, you could have an icebreaker, follow a dredged channel to the port, but when you turn that icebreaker around, that channel is no longer going to be over top of the dredge trough, right? The ice is going to move around, and you're going to have to break another. If you can figure out where the channel is, you're going to have to break another path right through it again. So the ice is going to keep moving around, and then that ice-broken path is not going to be guaranteed to be over top of the dredged area the next time you come back and pass through there, right? So I wish them all the best of luck. Great aspirations. I'm not sure how they're going to be able to do it. I guess with enough money, you can do anything.
So go ahead, Brown.
No, just last question. You mentioned, Blaine, Premier Canoe, and your recollection of a European delegation having come out to Manitoba and to Canada and had a look-see at both of these port potentials and so on, and then how Premier Canoe may have changed a little bit in terms of going from it's just a one port option, namely Churchill, to potentially envisaging a Port Nelson option or another option. Any idea where the Europeans are at? And this might be an unfair question, but just the Europeans are at, or the Brazilians for that matter, in terms of, yes, please fire this thing, fire whatever products you can out this route, and they'd go here or there. Any specifics that you're aware of in terms of actual logistical process from where it would go and where product would go and what product would go where?
A good example is LNG. We had Olaf Scholz come over from Germany asking Trudeau if he can buy LNG, and he said, "I don't think there's a business case for it." Well, you've got the Russians who are traditionally supplying Europe with gas, and the Europeans not wanting to buy Russian gas anymore, and by and large, we're the closest supplier. So it is going to be a very involved effort to get this thing going, but I think the market is there, especially for LNG. And if you can get the LNG side to set the port up and get the rail line in place, well, then it's just incremental stuff after that. Okay, we'll put in some warehouses for potash, and we'll get some more use out of the port like that. We'll get more and more traffic going in and out of Port Nelson, bringing different commodities in. But the key thing is to get the LNG operation in place, because it's going to get you the infrastructure that you need to start things going.
One of the things that came up in the video that was posted by NeeStaNan about a month ago, right in the middle of this Trump trade war. Again, a very good produced video, but it hasn't been seen by many people yet. Talked about, Canada diversifying its markets beyond the United States. And we haven't talked about that. And I think that's a key part here. And even though Trump's only going to be in power for another 3.5 years, and won't even start scratching dirt before then, maybe it will. How important is it for us to diversify our products of all the commodities we just talked about beyond going to the United States?
Very important. It's sad that we were so complacent over the years and just relying upon thinking that the United States is always going to be there. You're in a bad position if you're relying upon one trading partner and they've got a lot of leverage over your economy. So it's very important that we develop more trade routes, more trading partners, so we can diversify our trade around the world.
So, Blaine, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to mention or include?
Other than the fact that Port Nelson and NeeStaNan is not in competition with Churchill. We think Churchill has got a thriving ecotourism business going there that's known around the world. I don't think you would want to set up a large world-class industrial park right in the middle of the ecotourism situation.
Exactly.
I think the approach that might have more merit is for Manitoba to say, okay, let's focus heavy industry shipping in Port Nelson, and let's help Churchill continue to develop its ecotourism business and let that evolve. Because if we start bringing in ships 12 months of the year and we build a large port at Churchill, I don't think that's going to be compatible with the polar bears and the whales that they'd like to see coming around Churchill.
Yeah.
Well, and you would be bringing in a lot of business to the Hudson Bay Rail, at least up to Amory.
Yeah.
From its kickoff near the Paw, I believe it is, up to Amory. That would be you'd probably be not quintupling, but maybe 10 times the traffic of what they have now.
And that's a very good point, Brian. We see, especially on the LNG side, we'd like to really give it an awful lot of thought to not building a pipeline across 3 provinces, digging a ditch all the way across 3 provinces and laying the pipeline and building a large industrial park on the shore of Hudson Bay. What we think might be better is if we made LNG somewhere else and we railed it to Hudson Bay, and that way we could just have a short trestle going into the water with a large storage vessel there to hold the LNG rather than building a large industrial park. If we did that and we had 2 trains a day or 3 trains a day bringing LNG from, say, southern Manitoba or southern Saskatchewan to Hudson Bay, we could take advantage of existing rail, existing infrastructure to get the lion's share of this thing working. And more importantly, we would probably be one of the biggest shippers on Arctic Gateway on Hudson Bay Rail and help them get off requiring public funding for operations. So if we can get this to work, we should be a huge asset to the northern communities that own Arctic Gateway, and by providing them with third-party shipping revenues that they can rely upon year-round.
Well, thank you for your time, Blaine. And I think we'll let you go here. And Bronwyn and I are just going to chew the fat a little bit to wrap things up. I really appreciate the opportunity to have you on here because, you know, I've had a lot of skepticism on some of these things here, especially when it comes to, you know, year-round operations, stuff like that. I think you answered some of my questions, and you know, I really appreciate that. So thank you very much, Blaine.
Yeah,
It's been
thanks
a pleasure.
very much,
Thank
Blaine.
you. All right. Take care. Have a great day.
You
Bye now.
too.
Take care. All right, and so here we go. It's got a few more minutes to talk here, folks. If anyone wants to make a comment, interact on here. This has been a very interesting discussion. You know, I learned a fair bit. I did one of the things that's kind of I've been you know, concerned about is that the NeeStaNan webpage does not show the corridor. I think that's important that they show the corridor. So we were able to show that right here.
That was the yellow. That's the yellow.
Yeah, that's the one right there. But also,
so they do show it, or they don't show it.
This isn't. You can't find it on a web page. I think they need to add that to the web page.
Right.
Blaine was kind enough to send us to it. So I think the corridor, because just like of Northern Gateway, that was a big thing. But the other thing that I think was important is that in our discussion here, he talked about building a substantial island a couple kilometers offshore. That's the first time I've heard that, and that is a big thing because it's very easy for critics, including perhaps myself, to look at this thing from 100 years ago and say, well, you know, didn't work out 100 years ago. But as I pointed out, I mean, one dozer can do the work of 100 men.
But the ice thing remains an issue, though, Brian. I mean, you can build the island, and you can do that, but then you still are entrapped by ice. So, and we talked about this before here. This is the icebreaker that's been approved by C-SPAN, which is $3.15 billion. So the Coast Guard currently supplies icebreaking services, and I've been looking this up over the past weekend here for you know, the ports on the East Coast and going out to St. Lawrence Seaway and into the Great Lakes. It's not possible to do them year round, but they greatly extend the life of these ports, but they're also much further south than what we're talking here. Yeah. So let's go back to this graphic here. During the depths of winter, it's actually almost well into the springtime when you see all this red. You know, that is all the way to the northern tip of Newfoundland. That is a lot of ice. I can't really pause it on here, but that shows, you know, this is going to be the biggest challenge, I think. I was also happy to hear from Blaine that he said that they're able to, the Russians at least are able to do ice breaking over 10 knots, 10 to 12 knots, something along those lines. The C-SPAN webpage for that icebreaker says 3 knots. Now, I don't know if, if the Russians have more horsepower in theirs. I think their nuclear ships, you know, may have more oomph to that, which is probably a thing. But if you can go 10 knots, then that's perfectly acceptable. And that was one of my biggest questions about this is if you're going through all this distance, I mean, the Hudson Bay, people need to understand, is the size of the Gulf of Mexico. It's huge. And the distance from Churchill or Port Nelson to St. John's, Newfoundland is equal to the distance from St. John's to Cork, Ireland. Like that's a long ways to go. Yeah, absolutely. What did you think about the thing about oil? Because I'm kind of a little gobsmacked about that. Yeah, well, it's huge. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts. I certainly appreciate Blaine coming on. I mean, I absolutely do. I think that it's helpful, and this is very important to analyze, and there's a lot of detail there, and we learned some stuff, all important. But if ever there was an instance of reminder of why we would want something like Energy East as opposed to this, it's that discussion. It's those maps. It's the fact that, as he said, there's no interest in transporting oil at this time from Fort Mac. You just start to realize how involved this is, how complex it is, how costly it is. And I mean, from a funding perspective, right? I mean, you know, I did ask Blaine a number of ways, a number of times, just in terms of the funding of even the feasibility studies. Is a little unclear. It's private companies, it's private equity. there's governments, and there's governments. My bet would be that would be more in the 90% range in terms of the government funding. I mean, if we're talking $500 million for the feasibility on the Arctic Gateway Group to look at rehabilitating Churchill. That's the one owned and operated by 41 First Nations. That's a lot of money. And I think we absolutely must keep asking where the money is coming and where it's going, because that's of direct relevance to taxpayers in this discussion, and to not let it get too abstract. Because there is, a feasibility study. Do you really need to do a feasibility study on this for 2 years? It's pretty clear what we're dealing with. I mean, I think
I don't understand the entire idea of and see me scratching my head here, because it's like, really? Why would you build anything to Fort McMurray unless the idea is to ship oil? And
he was talking about bitumen pelts and that kind of thing.
But bitumen is oil. It's just a different name for a heavier type of oil. And when you're talking about the idea of this thing where they're talking about, making it into things like this, that's been talked about, but is anyone actually doing it? I haven't heard of any shipments of large scale shipments where this is happening on a regular basis.
And if we're talking about this Churchill thing or Port Nelson as a real feasible thing, then we better start talking about Russia. I mean, that's the apples to apples that we absolutely have to do. And I mean, I have a big note to myself with a big circle, Russia, apples to apples, because I think we have to look at, how long it took them to develop it. When did they start? Is it, if we're looking at an actual, like in terms of, ice patterns, weather patterns, is it the same? I mean, that's just, I think, it's a very interesting point that Russia's been doing this, and they have icebreakers, but they use nuclear powered breakers and so on. But I mean, we've really got to start looking then at that, if they're the only other country doing this. And then we have to always come back though to why. And the why is because Quebec will not take energy east. And if that's the why, then Western provinces better start saying, well, then, equalization payments have to get withheld until we can actually go through Quebec to Halifax, as opposed to doing these things. It's just, I really don't see it as absolute respect to Blaine. I mean, he's an advisor on this, but this is not a workable thing.
Well, the thing about, you're exactly right. Why would anyone go to Hudson Bay when you could go to an eastern port that is ice free? Are we going to spend tens of billions of dollars on projects? And this project here, if you're building through the Canadian Shield, we're talking probably one of the most expensive projects in Canadian history. It is not going to be cheap by any stretch. I can't see Alberta getting on board unless it involves a pipeline.
If there's no pipeline, I can't see Smith. They said they're on board. They just a few weeks ago, as we talked about, I mean, Premier Smith was talking with Premier Ford and I believe Premier Moe about, no, we're going to do it across the northern corridor. That's this one on this map, which those who can't see it, I mean, goes across, just where does it start? Fort Mac, and then it goes down through Meadow Lake Tribal territory. Yeah, go ahead, read it out.
So enlarge here on my screen a little bit. So starts in Fort McMurray, comes across to, just give me just a second, I gotta pull it up here. A little bit easier for me to see. So it starts in Fort McMurray and comes up, goes across to Illinois Cross, probably south of L'Orange, just south of L'Orange, hooks over to Flin Flon, and then follows basically the Nelson River on the way out.
Yeah.
So, a lot of that is still very much Canadian Shield. Very, very difficult to build. And I just can't see the Saskatchewan or the Alberta governments getting online unless expressly there is a pipeline, not shipping containers, not anything else. Unless there's a pipeline in this, I don't see how they get any backing when the push comes to shove on this.
And get some geologists and oil companies around a table for maybe make it a 2-day retreat, and you can save yourself a lot of feasibility money in the $500 million range. Pretty much can figure out what you'd need to do and who's going to pay for it and so on. I just, governments have to stop. They have to stop funding these lengthy things. This has been going on, he said, in the case of the Churchill project since 2017-18. And that's feasibility study after feasibility study. That's also a lot of, consultation, indigenous and otherwise. He was unclear, with respect about what the buy-in really is. Is it 10%, 90%? We don't really know. The other really important point that he raised, and I mean, I've certainly always felt this about Churchill. You go into Churchill, you're going to start, and you start building that up. You're going to get into that polar bear conversation so quickly, your head's going to spin, and certainly the polar bears' heads are going to spin. And Port Nelson may be a different discussion, but listen to this headline, Brian, from a few weeks ago. Arctic shipping noise is silencing narwhals and shifting their movements. Study. That's right. That's what you'd start getting into. Polar bears. It would be the whole ecotourism side of it, the Arctic pristine. He's talking about 2 national parks, circumnavigating Quebec, going into the north, into the Arctic. It's not going to happen. It is going to happen.
That whole idea about, I think it's called Wapusk, WAPUSK National Park. This is a park that I never even heard of until a few months ago. I don't think hardly anyone knows it exists.
Mm-hmm.
But that park was established under the Trudeau government. It is absolutely mammoth. It is basically, I don't know if I can pull a graphic up here. It's from east of Churchill all the way down to basically spitting distance of the old abandoned Port Nelson. So, and its idea is for polar bears. So just as you say, is that this park, I don't know if I can get a graphic of it here, is all about protecting polar bears and everything else offshore.
Yeah.
I strongly suspect that the Liberal government rapidly approved this. I have no proof of this, but it's just a guess.
Yeah.
That they approved this to put a crimp in any plans for any exports from Hudson Bay.
Yeah, so they should stop playing the provinces now. Just stop it. And the provinces should stop being played. I mean, and because Fort York is Fort York, the historic Fort York of Hudson's Bay lore, as I mentioned earlier, that in and of itself has a heritage designation, and it's Parks Canada. You go and look it up, you see it's Parks Canada. It's just got a lot of hair. The other thing you and I were talking about a few weeks ago is Al Gore, and how Al Gore was, and you had published this, and good on you, talking not so very long ago once again about how the whole Arctic is going to become de-iced. Or, well, yes, in effect. And I saw this in Blacklock's from February 12, I had saved it, of this year. Climate change may open Canada's most northerly deepwater port to export markets 300 days a year, says a federal briefing note. The Port of Churchill, initially built for wheat exports to the United Kingdom, is currently icebound 8 months out of 12. And I don't know. I mean, I think part of this conversation might be kind of around, well, climate change is going to lead to less ice up there, so therefore this is more feasible. And if that's the case, and that's part of the feasibility studies, quote unquote, we better be pretty clear scientifically about whether that is actually happening or not. And, if that's part of any calculus, federal government wise, because it appears to have been in a federal government briefing note, or otherwise, then where does that leave things in terms of a project like this? But I mean, it's just, everything's just way too abstract.
Here's some anecdotal stuff here, but I think it actually bears weight. Okay, so let me pull back the ice map. So it was about 1973 when my stepdad, he's passed away now, Brad Stroud, went to work at Churchill as a tugboat hand.
Mm-hmm.
He went to work in July because you couldn't do anything prior to July. And that was 52 odd years ago. And this is the ice map from last year. So in 50 years of all of our supposed climate change, of all of the ice is getting thinner and everything else, we are still seeing ice maps showing all the way from Churchill and Port Nelson all the way to beyond the tip of Labrador.
Yeah.
So where's all this, ice-free days? I'm not seeing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Well, and it's just, or if they're hedging prospective action at the port on of course, the climate change, which they, and I mean federal government, they and federal scientists and bureaucrats and so on, of course, do not, obviously don't want to happen. Nobody wants that to happen. That should still be part of a very open sort of scientific discussion around then the feasibility of the ports. I mean, if it hasn't, whose data are they using on this around this then could suddenly become less iced in? Because 8 months of the year, it's right in their briefing note, is pretty significant, and it's still 8 months of the year. So,
well, it's clear that, it's not going to be in 5 weeks or 5 years that we're going to have 300 ice-free days. It's more the inverse of that almost. So what it really means is that we will need a lot of these. We are going to need icebreakers, polar class icebreakers, big honking ones, which the price tag, like everything else federal now, $3 billion each. Will we need, I don't think 2 will be enough. These 2 that were ordered, they were ordered before anything happened here of Churchill or for Port Nelson. These were ordered obviously for existing needs for what we already have. Yeah. So if we're going to expand capacity of Port Nelson and Churchill, we're going to need, in addition to these ones, my guess is anywhere from 2 to 6. And if you're looking at $3 billion a crack in 5 years to build each one of them, that's the cost of a major pipeline to, I don't know, the West Coast. Never mind the pipeline for the corridor, or the roads, or the rail, or anything, or building a port. I mean, I like his idea of building a port offshore and starting from a clean slate of paper. If we could do container shipping, I mean, I know people who have shipped lentils and stuff like that through shipping containers. If we can have a container port that's coming off through Nelson, if we can do potash and everything else like that, I think there's real possibilities for that. But the ice thing, it's not going to go in your lifetime, my lifetime, my kids' lifetime, and their kids' lifetime. And anyone who thinks otherwise, I think they're dreaming in Technicolor.
Yeah, and I mean, just bottom line, show me the money trail, including, not only on the cost of the infrastructure buildup for either one of these ports, but the cost to get there. Of all the feasibility studies, what's everyone spent on it so far, and what have they come up with after years? Where are we at on consultation? Because we know that's a huge issue. You raised it on the Coastal GasLink. I raised it on Northern Gateway. And again, I mean, we've been talking about this a lot of late around the C5 discussion, the major projects bill federally, like how would all the parts fit together on something like this, where, in light of the clear federal priorities of full Indigenous buy-in and provincial veto?
So I want to pick up on that a little bit, because, I think the NeeStaNan project, in some ways, and I mentioned this in the promo, with First Nations backing, this could be the, as far as major projects go, this could be the way of the future. If we can get the First Nations on board and have an equity ownership in part of it, if we can do that, maybe this is the way things get built in the future. And I know Premier Smith has talked about this a little bit when she was at the Lloydminster Oil Show last year. Maybe this does deal with the whole reconciliation issue that's often brought up, and maybe this is the path forward. But the biggest difficulty are going to be, there are people in the First Nations community, and no one wants to say this out loud, but I will say it, who really are part of the bananas group, build absolutely nothing near anyone anytime, and who just will stand against anything when they, especially when they use pejorative terms like extractive resources, extracting stuff from the ground. And until we can bring that portion of First Nation society and bands on board of something like this, I don't know how any project is going to go ahead.
Well, and you can talk about full buy-in, and it is Indigenous led and operated fine. And is this the future? Potentially, except that the bombshell in that last hour with Blaine was, as we've now both noted, but it wouldn't be an oil pipeline.
And the
then
money
you
is
get,
oil. The money is absolutely oil. No oil,
that's
nothing
right.
else happens.
You know, and sure, LNG, although we're way behind the ball on that one. And I mean, he referenced the German chancellor coming over a few years ago, and we, as I said, showed him the door and said, "Here, would you like some green hydrogen instead?" And he said, "No, that's okay," and went to Japan to, you know, it's just, or wherever else he went.
We went to Qatar.
Sorry,
And signed a multi-decade agreement the next week.
That's right. Sorry. Japanese came over next week. Same answer. Also went elsewhere to get their LNG. I mean, it's just, so here we are now. Now we're saying, okay, LNG is our great panacea, and it's all going to be LNG. And that in and of itself takes a very long time to kind of get up and running. And the other thing is, if you have 41 or however many it is, First Nations groups who are backing this, if in fact it is 100% backed, or 50 or whatever it is, are some in favor of oil and others just LNG, or do they want it to be a potash thing, or do they want it to be a green hydro thing? Because I remember those days where people said, oh, the pipelines could then suddenly become hydrogen pipelines, and that could go through the Hudson Bay. I had those meetings, I had those conversations, right? So what exactly are we pitching here? What product? Transportation of what product to where, and what have we spent so far on figuring it out? Those are the most obvious seemingly questions to ask, and yet it doesn't seem clear what the answers are.
One of the things that we have to remember is that First Nations stances are not homogenous. They're not unitary. I'm reminded very clearly of a open house I went to in the spring of 2014 in Regina for the Energy East project. TransCanada put it on. I showed up later in the day, and there were a number of First Nations protesters there who were protesting the entire idea of Energy East. And CBC had packed up their cameras, so they were taking down all their signs because CBC was leaving. And I walked in there, so I started talking to these people, and the TransCanada handler, wanted to steer me away from them, and I walked right up to them and I asked them what their issues were. And this young man who was appointed to be the media handler thought, oh, here's another guy like CBC, and figured I would be asking the same sort of questions. And in speaking to these people, I said, one of them said that oil was a scar on Mother Earth. And I asked him, so you mean the oil that's produced out of the 10,000 barrels a day that comes out of Onion Lake First Nation, where most of the businesses and most of the jobs are oil related? And he started stuttering, and he couldn't believe. He said, well, do they know about that? I said, yeah, I think they know about it. They're employed in it. I said, what about the oil that comes out of White Bear First Nation in Southeast Saskatchewan, which has pump jacks, throughout it? Those people are in favor of it. But yet, and he actually said, you're asking the wrong questions. I said, no, I'm asking questions that aren't CBC questions. And, that's part of the issue that has to be dealt with in this, is that there are some people who are absolutely against everything.
And that unfortunately includes in this conversation, I mean, indirectly includes Quebec and the very strong environmental faction, let's say out east, not only in Quebec, but generally east of Manitoba, even east of Saskatchewan, and the environmental movement, the activism, but really just the hatred of all things fossil fuel related. And LNG has been part of that conversation this last decade or so, and has been included in that. So now it's sort of, okay, well, now it would be LNG because it's actually might be profitable. Would it really be? But the thing is, if you start talking about the polar bears and the ecotourism and the narwhals, and just, and polling is positive, in light of the Trump effect, more positive than it's been on oil in Quebec and Ontario, specifically Quebec. And that's great. That's positive. But then let's start talking about Energy East again, though. Let's not do the circumnavigation thing. That's not going to happen. Never going to happen.
Your point about the whales is very apropos about Energy East, because the original concept for Energy East was to have not one export port, but two. One was supposed to be at at St. John, New Brunswick, but the other one was the south shore of we call it the St. Lawrence, at a place called Kakuna, which was supposed to have an export port right there in Quebec. And
That
that
is
was
right.
rapidly killed because, oh my God, there's some whales in the Fort St. Lawrence, and these godforsaken tankers could interrupt the whales. And yet the tankers coming in from Saudi Arabia into the port of Montreal, well, I guess those ones are just fine.
And that's precisely the assessment that a bill such as Bill C-69 enters into is environmental impact, it's fisheries, it's waters, it's federal fisheries. That's still not been repealed. That's still on the books. It would still enter into the discussion 100%. People laugh and they think these things where you talk about whales or a certain kind of frog or are kind of irrational, never going to happen. That's absolutely not the case. In Britain, they've had to blast open decades of environmental assessments that took into account bats when building roads and the impact on bats. Like this really happens. The whales thing, as you said, it happens. The narwhal thing definitely would happen. And the polar bear thing, of course, would happen. So it's just.
I mean, I would really like to see a First Nation muscle a national park, which has already been recently established, into saying, nope, we're going to develop that. One of the things about the Trans Mountain Pipeline that most people aren't aware of is that the portion that went through Jasper was built in 2007, 2008. I remember driving through Jasper when the pipe was on the side of the highway. And I remember, kind of wondering what's going on here. And they knew Trans Mountain was eventually going to get expanded. And because they were never going to be allowed to build that national park again, they had to build it then 15 years before the rest of the pipeline would get built, because thou shalt not build pipelines through national parks, because even though that's the only way to get through the Rockies, God forbid you build a pipeline through a national park.
Yeah.
So how a First Nation is going to say, well, we want TLE land, that land has already been designated, and the huge size of that park. I mean, I think they just took a line and said, okay, no one cares about this part of Manitoba, it's now a park. I really think that was deliberate on the federal Liberals to negate any possible future development, because not like they would have done that if any other maritime issues either.
And just to go back on the historical thing for a moment. So he was saying when we were talking about, so it was a matter of Port Nelson became very silted up, and I get it. That's 100 years ago. That would be different now. And he talked about some of the posts along the Nelson River, which also would diminish because of dams and so on, the silting. So I get that, less silty now potentially than it maybe was. But the whole buildup of Churchill for grain, for example, evolved out of the flaws of then Port Nelson, right? For that kind of transport through the bay. Is that your understanding? Like, what?
The entire reason to build either or was to get Canadian grain out to Hudson Bay.
But they stopped using it. They stopped doing that from Port Nelson, I assume for a reason, even though they encountered a lot of issues up to Churchill.
Hudson Bay or Port Nelson was never anywhere close to completed. Not anywhere close. No cargo ever left Port Nelson to my knowledge. So
and they built Churchill because faster through the bay, or do you know why logistically?
Because Port Nelson simply at that time, the technology they had was totally impractical.
Yeah. Okay.
So they realized this isn't going to work. Let's go to Churchill.
And then that picture of the railway line underwater, where is that again?
So that is part of the muskeg part here. I'll pull that up. So, I mean, muskeg is basically swamp. I mean, that's and when you have a lot of rain, it gets swampy. Yeah. So let's see if I can.
And so they were trying to build that railway from up to Churchill.
So this is the existing railway to Churchill. There were many places where the water was up a few years ago and it washed out, and it shut down Churchill. Churchill was a dead letter for several years.
Yeah.
Because nothing could get there. And also because there is no road to Churchill, that meant that traffic from everything from fuel to vehicles to people, that all goes by rail. You want to get a car up there, you have to put it on a rail car to get it there, or a pickup truck.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that needed to get to Churchill, was basically cut off. And I think it was a year or two before they actually got into it. We are going pretty long on time here. Yeah. So is there anything you want to wrap up, Bronwyn?
Nope. I just found it very interesting. Thanks, Brian.
So I guess I just want to finish here by saying, you know, some people might think that I'm very, well, I'm absolutely opinionated, that's for sure. But some people may think that I can't have my mind changed. Well, I think this conversation definitely opened my eyes to some things that maybe Port Nelson should seriously be looked at. I don't know if it's going to be for oil, but maybe when it comes to container traffic and shipping commodities like potash and possibly LNG, you know, maybe there's a real case to be made for Port Nelson here. And the fact that the rail line could be built on essentially pit run, you know, hard gravel, that is huge. I did not know that before. So maybe the northern corridor across the Fort McMurray might not happen, but maybe there's stage one, which takes them from the end of the railhead to the port and actually gets something to the shore. That could be, you know, game changing for Saskatchewan potash, for Manitoba minerals as well. And if we can get oil at a pipeline as well, maybe that's next down the road. But apparently, it's not the first thing.
Yeah, it was a great discussion, and that's why we should be having these more in-depth, detailed chats about these things.
So we haven't got anything lined up yet for next week, folks. We're probably going to be moving back a week because of the long weekend, and some people actually need holidays. So we'll keep you apprised as to what's coming up next. There is a lot to talk about in the energy space, and thank you very much for your time, folks.